Certain fields of journalism, especially conflict coverage and investigative reporting, have risks attached. Every journalist who decides to travel to a war zone or scrutinise the unscrupulous understands this, and in recent years especially, an associated industry has developed in mitigating those hazards so that journalists can be better prepared. That's the good news. The bad news is that none of this has made these kinds of journalism noticeably less dangerous. Indeed, by the reckoning of the Committee to Protect Journalists, 2024 was the most dangerous year for journalists since the CPJ was founded in 1981. 124 journalists and media workers were killed worldwide last year. The majority of those, 82, were Palestinian casualties of Israel's war in Gaza, which at best has been no more careful of journalists than it has of any other civilians. At worst, by the reckoning of the CPJ and other analysts, journalists have been deliberately targeted by the Israel Defense Forces. But last year, journalists were killed in relation to their work in at least 16 countries. Sudan, Pakistan and Mexico were also notably treacherous. All of which, dreadful though it is, does not take into account the scarcely calculable harassment and intimidation enabled by the online realm, and now boldly encouraged by leaders of nation-states, including at least one which is supposed to be a big fan of a free press. Why has reporting become so much more dangerous? How is the threat evolving? And how can journalists best protect themselves now? This is the Foreign Desk.
But the Israel-Gaza war has transformed the landscape of press reporting because journalists are not only being killed, they have their families being killed, they have their homes destroyed, they are being arbitrarily detained, and in many cases they are obligated to self-censor.
One of the policemen in the car said to me, "This is the state doing this. This is not us. We don't agree with this."
The number of online and cyber threats now equals or surpasses physical threat.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Doja Daoud, the Committee to Protect Journalists Middle East and North Africa representative. Doja, it's the obviously extreme case of Gaza we want to focus on here because there have been shocking numbers of journalists killed in that war. Does it strike you, though, that this is an outlier, or are we seeing here a demonstration of what has become a new reality for journalists everywhere?
Well, this war is unprecedented in CPJ's history, as more journalists and media workers have been killed in the Israel-Gaza war than any other year since we have been documenting, we began documenting journalist killing in 1992. To date, CPJ's investigations showed at least 176 journalists and media workers have been killed in the Israel-Gaza war. 168 of them were Palestinians reporting from Gaza. 2 of them were Israeli and 6 were also Lebanese. In short, we've never seen a conflict as fatal for press in our history as CPJ, and the brunt of these attacks are borne by Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Gazan journalists are the only people who can report from Gaza, as foreign media is still prevented from going in. And the Palestinian journalists have continued to report despite killings, injuries, arbitrary detention, and other forms of violations of press freedom at the hands of the Israeli forces. Unfortunately, this is unprecedented, but we, of course, fear that this becomes a norm for journalists elsewhere. We are seeing more killings in the MENA region of journalists. We are seeing that authorities are copying some of the mechanisms of killing journalists in Gaza elsewhere in the region. So yes, we are alarmed by this, and we fear that this might escalate into other areas.
I mean, it may seem like a silly question, but it is one worth asking just so we're clear on what we're talking about. For all that, obviously a great many of the casualties occasioned in Gaza have been a function of the fact of hitting a densely populated urban area, less discriminately than might be ideal. But is it the CPJ's view that journalists are being quite deliberately and knowingly targeted in Gaza?
Well, in our investigations, our reporting till now has found that 17 journalists and media workers were deliberately targeted by Israeli forces, in which CPJ classifies as murders. 4 of them were in Lebanon and 13 were in Gaza. And we're still investigating 20 other cases in which we think there might be a direct killing of journalists in Gaza and in Lebanon. And in total, 70% of the total killings last year globally happened in the war, and Israel was responsible for them. So there have been targeted murders, and we've seen also that drones have been increasingly used in targeted murders, as 4 of the 10 journalists murdered in Gaza in 2024 were killed by drone strikes. Of course, because we can't enter Gaza, there are little information and investigations happening because there is no media access and investigators can't go into Gaza. So we can't collect more evidence to speak about the other cases of killings of journalists that we documented in the past 1.5 years.
Does it strike you, though, that the risk has changed? Reporting conflict has always obviously been a risky endeavour, and especially trying to report from a place like Gaza, where none of these journalists have the option of leaving, not just because it's their home, but also because the strip is completely sealed off. Has it become the case, not just in Gaza, but more generally, that governments and militaries are being less careful about sparing journalists, or possibly even more willing to deliberately target them?
Well, I think that's definitely the case, because when perpetrators or killers of journalists don't get accountability and aren't held to account, definitely that will send a message to all perpetrators and killers of journalists around the globe that that's okay. The international community has an obligation to stand up for the Gazan journalists, for the Palestinian journalists, for the Lebanese journalists, for all journalists that are being killed, and to demand accountability in these crimes. Of course, reporting on conflict has its inherent dangers, but the Israel-Gaza war has transformed the landscape of press reporting from a war zone. We've seen a lot of evidence on that, especially in our reporting and investigations, because journalists are not only being killed, they have their families being killed, they have their homes destroyed, they are being arbitrarily detained, and they are being legally harassed. And in many cases, they are also obligated to self-censor, especially journalists in Israel who are not allowed to document what's happening in Gaza in terms of Palestinian killings.
I mean, on that thought of accountability then, do structures or processes exist that might impose accountability on people who've given these instructions? Is there, for example, any work underway in terms of pursuing justice for journalists killed in Gaza?
Israel should be cooperating with the International Court of Justice and any international criminal court investigations and warrants in respect of war crimes against journalists. And in cases where the killing of a journalist likely amounts to an international crime, like the targeted killings of journalists in Gaza or elsewhere, other governments can also consider using the universal jurisdiction. Right now, journalists and international investigators need access to Gaza in order to investigate and gather evidence of journalist killings in the occupied Palestinian territories. This would be a persecutor for any accountability. To date, no one has been held accountable in any of the killings of journalists in the Israel-Gaza war, which the majority of our reporting found that happened on the hands of the Israeli military. But also, predating this war, the Israeli military has a long history of denying responsibility of killing journalists, which In our CPJ May 2023 report, Deadly Pattern, we found that at least 20 journalists were killed over 22 years at the hands of the IDF, with no one ever being charged or held to account. And the last case of those was Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American journalist her family is seeking accountability from the US and elsewhere and has still found nothing. We also had a British journalist who was killed in the West Bank at the hands of the IDF. His family tried to do their best in terms of accountability and they filed lawsuits, but the cases reached nowhere, unfortunately.
I mean, just finally then, is there a fear that if there is no accountability at all in the extreme case of Gaza, that this sort of thing becomes normalized, that it sort of starts to be seen as more or less acceptable to actually go hunting for journalists if they're trying to cover a war that you are waging?
Of course, we fear that, and we are seeing that there's a surge in killing of journalists. 2024 was a record year in killings of journalists around the globe for CPJ, and we're also seeing a deadly pattern, a new one, where drones are being used to target journalists deliberately from Russia and Ukraine to Iraq and Turkey, and then to Israel and Gaza. So this pattern is being copied elsewhere. And whenever a country that has allies that usually push for human rights, for accountability in journalist murders and in other cases, who stay silent in the murders of Palestinian and Gazan journalists, then yes, other governments, especially authoritarian governments who usually go away with murders of journalists, will use that again, and they will say that no one held Israel accountable, then we can get away with murder.
Doja Dawood, Middle East and North Africa representative with the CPJ, thank you for joining us. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our next guest is Nathan Puffer, Senior Vice President for Risk and Resilience at Dow Jones. Nathan, first of all, can you give our listeners a sense of what your day job actually entails?
Well, it's me and a team of people who spend all our time, perhaps more time than we'd like, intermittently, trying to ensure that Dow Jones, publisher of the Wall Street Journal, Barron's, Financial News, etc., and a couple of B2B products, can carry out what it wants in the kind of business realm, unfettered by the risks that they face in today's world. So that's the normal corporate stuff that everybody does, through to a very focused effort on protecting journalists and making sure journalists can carry out their kind of critical role in society without being exposed to undue risks.
It's those risks to journalists that we are especially interested in. And do you get a sense that the nature of the threat has changed over the last 10 or 20 years or so?
I mean, over 10 to 20 years, it's changed dramatically. I think there's elements of that which have changed more specifically in the last 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years. To some extent, it's this reality of a rising tide lifting all ships, if I could frame that in a really negative sense, which is, there's the evolution of kind of the world in which we live, from the global war on terror and what journalists face predominantly in the Middle East over time. And how that's shifted as we've gone in towards, war in Europe and political and social change and in some ways upheaval. That broader global geopolitical context of risk obviously has an effect on the nature of media more broadly, and specifically the risk for journalists, whether that's in news gathering or sitting in their living rooms at home in the evening, particularly as this growing convergence is manifested between the digital realm, cyberspace, online harassment, online threats, and the physical world.
Do you think there is a growing sense, whether in conflict zones or not, that journalists are just increasingly a fair target?
I do think that. I think as some normative behaviors around the protections of the press or respect of the press's role in society have eroded, and as the threats born from kind of non-state or sub-state actors have become more pronounced in lots of different geographies, those normative behaviors have eroded. And I think there's a general perception that journalists are, either because of how the role of media is cast in society or the realities of journalists being on the ground, I think they do face a degree of threat that they haven't faced in the past. And I think that's a pretty dynamic and fast-moving evolution that requires some critical thinking and an awareness to really treat and address. Because even though that risk context has changed, what journalists do and the ways they need to do it, which is being out in the world and collecting information, speaking with people, has not.
You mentioned earlier that the idea that some threats had changed or accelerated, particularly just in the last few years. What did you mean by that?
There is a reality in which journalists at one time were considered nominally safe, particularly in the countries of their origin. So you can talk about that in the UK or European context. You can talk about that in the US context. And as the role of journalists in society have been cast differently, or this growing sense of tribalism has pitted some media entities or some specific personalities at odd to a pervasive or an increasingly more aggressive segment of the society or a subsegment of the society, where that's a political orientation, that's more of a social one. The journalists are seen as a representative and an attitude or perspective that might be truthful and based on fact and reason and expertise, are seen as an opponent in that space. And with that sense of opposition comes ever greater interest in targeting journalists for doing their jobs.
Do you think as well there's a thing that entities like governments and militaries, perhaps in an information space where social media has become such a thing, have started to think they don't need the media in the way they once did? I mean, it strikes me as noticeable that in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, we see much less reporting from embedded reporters than we might have expected in a similar conflict 20 or 30 years ago, or even independent reporters, because the battle space is so tightly managed by both protagonists.
I think there's some truth in that. I think the other dynamic that's at play and negatively impacts the perception of journalists' value and role in society is people's increasingly disassociated relationship with the truth, or how the truth or information is managed in those different environments. And I think journalists continue to deliver high quality information that is true and accurate and representative of the facts on the ground. But if the facts on the ground are controlled or depicted in different ways by different governments or entities, then there's just more competition for the accuracy of that information. And that has a detrimental effect towards media more broadly, and can have a detrimental effect towards journalist safety.
I mean, if we're looking for some, I guess, positive developments in the last few years, have you seen indication that media organisations are getting more serious and more responsible about making sure that people on the ground are trained, equipped, insured, all of that stuff, especially when they're hiring freelancers who often are in places on a wing and a prayer, and are often, especially when they're younger freelancers, willing to take risks in the hope of advancing their careers?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I've been in this space for coming up on 10 years now, having lived a different, more kind of government-centric life. And over that decade of experience, in particular over the last 5 years, I have definitely seen our peers, collaborators, partners in this space. We don't really frame them as competitors, think much more dynamically in a much more concerted and eager way about supporting their own people, journalists on the ground, and also considering their duty of care for freelancers. And whether that's through making sure they're appropriately equipped or supported, trained, that they do have good insurance mechanisms in place, or that kind of all-important foundational element of, are we thinking about risk in a real contemporary way that considers the shifting threat landscape? And do we have good, mature, progressive practices in place to meet the threats we're seeing now and the trend line of threats that we think are coming down the track? And not thinking about that in terms of my reporter in the war zone is a foreign correspondent, but also who's my reporter in Washington going to a rally? Who's the freelancer I'm putting out there to do vox pop somewhere, immigration protests in Europe, whatever the case might be. They've really, commensurate with the change in the environment, have really opened the aperture and said to themselves, we need to do more, and we need to do what we do better to really service the community and make sure those risks are capably addressed.
That was Nathan Puffer, Senior Vice President for Risk and Resilience at Dow Jones. This is the Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Joining me now is James Brabazon, Head of High Risk Production at Channel 4 here in the UK. James has also worked as a journalist and filmmaker, winning awards for his coverage of Liberia, Iraq, Somalia and Syria, among other conflict zones. James, first of all, overall, do you think it is more dangerous doing that kind of reporting than it was maybe 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that the spectrum of threats that journalists face has increased, diversified and become more complex. I mean, without wishing to be glib, probably the most difficult challenge that journalists face is actually getting paid enough to be a journalist. But perhaps that's a different question. I'd say, I started off myself working as frontline conflict journalist and did that as a photographer and as a filmmaker for years. And when I was working in the field, predominantly the threats that we were facing were the kind of classic bombs and bullets threats and risks that probably most people are familiar with. Working in West Africa, in civil wars, police operations, that kind of thing. You're dealing with perhaps two state armies facing off against each other, or maybe groups of insurgents. And that was difficult enough and unpleasant enough. But the number of people engaged in that kind of conflict-oriented news gathering, journalism, the documentary space was pretty limited. I mean, there was a period of time in the UK where I pretty much knew every single person that was doing that 20 years ago. And now I'm in a position where I advise and oversee high-risk filming deployments. You can see really clearly that the spectrum of threats has changed, partly because, and these things interlink with one another, partly because there are many, many more people undertaking acts of journalism in high-risk environments. That's partly because the technology has become more accessible, both in terms of how to operate it and the cost. It's also cheaper and easier to travel to conflict zones.
Because to put that in perspective, when you were making films, say, 30 years ago, you were having to travel with quite a lot of equipment, whereas now you can plausibly do it with the phone in your pocket.
That's right. I think probably Libya 2011 was really like the birth of iPhone conflict journalism. You could get from London to the front line near Benghazi in a day. And you didn't really need to have much more than, a couple of £100 and an iPhone and you're away. And when I was filming in Liberia, for example, during the Second Civil War in the early 2000s, I was the only filmmaker who had access to the rebels at all. Just me. And it took a long time to get there and it was very expensive and I couldn't have done it without, a production company behind me. However, one of the key determining changing factors has been now that local journalists, nationals of the countries in which these events are taking place, are now enthusiastically reporting on them themselves. So citizen journalism is a big deal, and that means that there are a lot more people operating, and therefore not only the threats more complex and diverse, but they affect more people because more people are working in that space. So you can see something like Gaza, for example. Back when I was reporting on Gaza, they were predominantly, though not exclusively, obviously, international crews going into film events happening. Now, international crews can't get in, and all news coverage is done internally, generated by journalists on the ground themselves. And we see that across different conflicts, maybe whether that's in Indonesia, in Burma, Myanmar. What's coming out in terms of conflict journalism is quite often locally generated. And that means it's also often generated by citizen journalists who may also be activists, which means that verifying the reports, verifying information, verifying the authenticity and credibility of that reporting becomes difficult. becomes more difficult.
For editors and consumers alike.
For editors and consumers alike, so that, we're very grateful for the work that locals do. But I think that what the work that local journalists do then also puts them at a different spectrum of risk because they're working in environments, particularly where there's that activist element, where they are likely to be targeted specifically for the work they are doing and specifically because they're journalists, whether that's, you can see that happening in Gaza and the occupied territories by the Israeli authorities, and that's well documented. You can see that also happening in Myanmar, for example, or other repressive regimes where it's in the regime's interest to target people who are trying to broadcast material.
I just want to pick up on that question of the technology you mentioned that has made some of these places more accessible and the idea of being a journalist more accessible. Have similar technologies also made being a journalist more dangerous? Because even when you think about just the old school bullets, bombs, explosions, etc., if you were lucky, there was always a degree to which you could hide from those, or you could hide from people who were looking for you. But is it not now the case that journalists, if people want to find them, we're much easier to find?
Yeah, and I think, sort of I've outlined really is an evolving space in perhaps a more traditional way of looking at conflict journalism. If you just take a step back on that and think that obviously we're not just looking at wars, we're also looking at high-risk undercover operations. You might be infiltrating a far-right organisation. You might be going undercover to expose something which is in the public interest. In another sphere where maybe organised crime, for example, and those can be domestic investigations by, for example, British journalists investigating things in Britain, which can be potentially lethally dangerous. And I think in the past, there has been a feeling that it was possible to protect identities, both of journalists and sources, and that somehow, if you were careful enough and once your work was broadcast, you would be able to escape the ire of the people that you had investigated if you were careful enough. That may have been misguided at times, but there was definitely a strong sense of that. Now, I'd say probably in the last 5 years that in doing the work that I do, the number of online and cyber threats now equals or surpasses physical threat.
Is there, just in closing and trying to close on a semi-optimistic thought, is there anything that any of us can actually do about that beyond keeping a false beard to hand?
Well, I can guarantee that my beard is absolutely genuine.
Which is what you would say.
It's really difficult. I think anyone that's working in a public space should think extremely carefully about what they put online. You should guard your data, your personal data, with the same tenacity that you would guard naked photographs of yourself, because they have the capacity to cause you as much trouble if they get into the public domain.
James Brabazon, thank you for joining us. That was James Brabazon, Head of High Risk Production at Channel 4. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, and joining us finally is a reporter who has recently experienced personally the unenthusiasm of some governments for being reported on. It's Mark Lowen, the BBC news correspondent who in March this year was detained in and then deported from Turkey. Mark, welcome to the show. First of all, how do they tell you that you are being thrown out?
I was told with a piece of paper presented to me at 2:00 in the morning. So that was 12 hours after I had been taken into custody by Turkish police. So they held me for all of that time in two different locations. And at 2:00 in the morning, the head honcho came to me. And I think he was probably undercover intelligence, actually, dressed in Crocs and tracksuit bottoms. And he presented me with a piece of paper and it said reason for deportation. And there were different boxes. One of them said supporting terrorism, which was not ticked. And my box was threat to public order. And I said to him, what does that mean? And he said, well, that's a decision by the government. I can't elaborate. And I said, but you do realise we're going to report on this? And he said, oh, there's no problem at all. And, I just needed to sign acknowledgement of it, that I was aware. And then I said to him, Andrew, am I going to be banned from Turkey after this? And he said, I'm not actually sure, but I've got an idea. Why don't I could film you saying you're leaving voluntarily and of your own volition, and then I could show that to my bosses, and then we could say, all fine and you can come back. And I said politely, thanks, but no thanks, knowing that would be kind of delivered to the Turkish media, pro-government media, to sort of control the narrative. And once I'd signed that and acknowledged it, I was then taken for another 5 hours of custody, so 17 hours in total, and then put on the flight to London.
Just to go back to 17 hours before you get put on the flight, and i.e. 12 hours before you're told you're being tossed out of the country, we should probably have told listeners at the start to write this down because the timeline is becoming quite complicated. What was the original reason you were given for why they were taking you in?
No reason at all. So I had been in Istanbul for 2.5 days reporting on the biggest protests against the government in more than a decade after the jailing of the mayor of Istanbul, and had no problem out and about reporting. I mean, there was police tear gas at the protest and things as I know well, because I was the correspondent in Turkey for the BBC for 5 years in 2014, which was a really tumultuous time. And then on day 3, I was in my hotel room. And at 2 p.m, the phone rang in my hotel room, and the receptionist said, "Can you come down? We've got something urgent to talk to you about in person." And I went down and found plainclothes policemen there who said, "Come with us." And I was whisked off to the first of 3 custody units, and that first of that detention. And I have to say, one of the policemen in the car said to me, "This is the state doing this. This is not us. We don't agree with this." So kind of from the outset, I could feel that there were doubts among some of the policemen, about the reason for this detention.
Are you given any training or any advice about how to respond in such circumstances? Because things like this are kind of an occupational hazard for the journalist reporting from somewhat fraught circumstances. If you do it for often enough in enough places, something like this will happen eventually.
We, like most media organisations, have mandatory training, hostile environment training it's called, which we have to renew every 3 years. And that is a course on a number of different topics, including first aid and the like. And, you discuss kind of brushes with authorities there. Everybody's brush with the authorities is slightly different. So there was no direct sort of training for what would happen in this situation. But, I mean, I had the advantage of speaking the language to a certain degree, not brilliantly, but enough, having been based there, knowing the country, and sort of generally being quite a calm person. And I think that it is drummed into you from, in large media organisations, kind of how to deal with the authorities as a journalist. You have to be, as you know, Andrew, you have to be sort of charmingly pushy, I think. And I just knew that in that kind of situation, the name of the game was keep calm, be nice, be cooperative, but don't let them completely push you around.
Try to get the small wins where you can, or
Exactly.
try to control what you can control.
Exactly. And for the first 7 hours of the 17 hours, I was allowed access to lawyers and my colleagues and the like. When I was moved to the second location, for the last 10 hours, I was not allowed that. And I did kick up a bit of a fuss and said, I need to continue to speak to lawyers. And then the atmosphere was hardening a little bit because they were getting frustrated by me. I was getting frustrated by them. I have to say I was not mistreated at all through the 17 hours. But, I was demanding my rights. And also I was kind of saying, you realise that the British Embassy and British Consulate are going to be also on your backs about this. So I think that, yes, we need to be cooperative and we're trained to be kind of, kind and all that sort of thing. But also we have to be aware as journalists of our rights as nationals, particularly in a country that ostensibly respects the rule of law, Turkey, but which, of course, in many ways doesn't.
I mean, one of the reasons we wanted to make this programme is to look at how threats to journalists are evolving, because reporting from rickety places has always been a hazardous business. But does it strike you that anything is changing, especially in the way, to bring it back to your specific story, that authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, authoritarian-adjacent regimes, such as Turkey's, becoming a little bit less concerned with any damage it might do to their reputation.
I think that that's certainly the case, and I think it's partly because there is the kind of strong man's club of world leaders who feel emboldened by each other. So I don't mean to sort of blow my own position up too much, but, would the Turkish government have felt as at ease to go after the BBC in this way if they didn't have a president in the White House that is just absolutely unconcerned with authoritarianism and, himself calls for his own political opponents to be locked up? I don't know. I mean, it is possibly a facet of that, and also the fact that President Erdogan has been in power for more than 20 years and doesn't, he's very confident in his own position. But I think certainly leaders like Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey are feeling increasingly unchained and unbound by norms and emboldened by others in Hungary and Israel and other sort of strongman leaders. And we as journalists have to be aware of that. And I perhaps naively went there on this trip thinking they wouldn't go after me. It didn't even occur to me. I lived there for 5 years and I was reporting normally. I wasn't blowing, I wasn't distorting the truth. But the norms that we had come to perhaps expect and take for granted perhaps no longer exist.
Mark Lowen, BBC correspondent, thank you for joining us. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and to our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.